Hello? Okay, let me just check. I haven't got any sound here at the moment, so I can see you, Amir, but my camera doesn't appear to be working for some reason. Okay, are you able to hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay, you can hear me. I'm just trying to work out why my camera is not working. Um, we may have to go ahead without it.
Hello, do you hear my voice?
Hello, I can hear you. I'm just trying
That's
to,
good.
yes, I'm trying to work out why my camera is not working. I think it seems to think that something else is using my camera. I do not know why. Okay. Okay, it does not appear to want to, the camera does not appear to want to turn on. Okay, does everybody have sound? Okay, does Amir have sound? Just checking. Okay, just bear with me. Okay, does everybody hear me? Uh, okay, does anybody hear me at all? Is anybody getting any sound from me? Please, please, please just work for me. Okay, let's just try again. Let me just try if I can get my camera to work.
David,
Aha, it's
what kind of?
it's
Oh
working.
yeah,
Okay,
I uh,
okay, thank God. Sometimes it thinks that something else is using my camera or microphone, so I just had to restart. Now, today I will be talking about travel, but first, um, I'm just trying to see. Okay. Is there anybody who can't see or hear me, or anybody who is not getting sound?
We can hear you.
Great. I'm just trying to make sure I haven't left anybody behind. Okay, we can get started. Today I'm going to be talking about travel, and today is going to be about travel, and it's going to be a question and answer session. So you might want to ask about travel arrangements, transport within the United Kingdom. You might also want to talk about visas, and that came up in the previous session. I have got a video now available online which gives you a little bit of basic outline about the visa process, but there are a lot of different types of visa. Generally speaking, in order to gain access to the United Kingdom with a 5-year work visa, you will need to have level B2, which is equivalent to IELTS level 5.5 to 6. But there are some areas of work, for example the medical profession, where the requirements are a lot more stringent. For example, the medical profession, you generally need to be at IELTS 7, which is a little over C1 in the CEFR test. Does anybody have any questions about visas before we move on?
not you, David. Continue, carry on.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the first thing I want to talk about is travel. That is going to be the theme of today's session. So does anybody have any questions related to travel at all? Either within the United Kingdom or to and from the country?
What is the most popular things in the UK
The
for
most
travel?
the most
The
pop
most popular.
Okay, the most popular things in the UK. Do you mean things to do in the United Kingdom?
I mean, for traveling.
Okay, I'll explain a little bit about our infrastructure. I live in London, and we are very lucky in London because we have a lot of options for getting around. We have the metro, which we call the Underground here in London, which covers the city quite well, but there are a few parts of London which are not well served by the Underground. The southeast of London never had the Underground extended to it, so parts of London have what is called the Docklands Light Railway, which fills in where the Underground never built to. I'm not sure the reason why the Underground was not extended into the southeast of London. London also has overground rail services within the capital and to other parts of the country. You will find that the stations which serve London serve particular parts of the country. So, for example, for the Midlands and the North West, there is Paddington Station. King's Cross serves East Anglia and the north of the country. London Bridge serves the south east, Kent down to the port of Dover and the Channel Tunnel. Waterloo serves the south west. Rail links between other cities are fairly frequent, but we do have quite expensive fares in the United Kingdom. In fact, I'm sad to report that rail fares in this country are among the highest in Europe, although if you know how to, you can get discounts by booking the right tickets at the right time. It's a very complicated process though, understanding how the rail tickets work, and it would in itself be a good subject for a thesis to try to explain all of the rules you can use to help keep transport costs on the rail network down. Our road network countrywide is very variable, dependent on area. Some parts of the countries are connected well by road, others not so well. A lot of our main roads in this country follow the routes of old Roman roads. For example, the A1, which runs from London up to Edinburgh, and it passes very close to where my mother lives, is on the route of an old Roman road. The A5 similarly links London to North Wales, and that is another Roman route, and the Romans famously built their roads very straight, so those routes are quite direct. Some parts of the country are more challenging to access the road. Roads are very patchy in Scotland. In the Highlands of Scotland there are very few major roads, and the same thing is true of the interior of Wales. Some of the places on the coast which are best linked by road are those which are major ports. For example, the port of Dover, where there are ferry services to mainland Europe, to Calais in France, Zeebrugge in Belgium, for example, and there are other ferry services from different points in the UK to other French ports, Ireland, Scandinavia, Germany, Holland, Belgium, and ultimately on to America and the rest of the world. We do have one rail link which has been around for the last 30 years since it opened, and that is the Channel Tunnel. The Channel Tunnel is a tunnel which connects the southeast of England, Dover, through to Calais in the corner of France, and there was a big celebration when the Channel Tunnel opened back in 1991. I remember it well. It was the same year as I left school. So we do have that rail link to the continent. The trains go from King's Cross in London through to Calais and eventually on to Brussels and Paris as well. You can also change to other European cities from Paris or from Calais. Ultimately, you can also travel on to Germany from Brussels as well. So it is possible to travel from the United Kingdom to other European countries by rail. Now, for longer journeys, you'll obviously want to travel by air, and most of our major airports are around the southeast of England. The closest to me is London Heathrow, one of the busiest airports in the world. There are also going to be other airports which do provide international services. Manchester is one in the northwest which is an international airport. Cardiff and of course Edinburgh are also in Scotland are also served by air, but not as directly. Around London you have London Stansted, which is north of London. in the direction my mother lives, it's north of London, and it's a train ride out to get to London, Stansted from London itself. Gatwick is actually south of London in Sussex, but it is well served by road and rail from London itself. And there are other airports and places like Cardiff in Wales, Bristol, Belfast in Northern Ireland, Leeds and Bradford also have airports too, but the London airports are the main air terminus for international flights, particularly Heathrow and Gatwick. Okay, that's just a general breakdown of the transport system into and out of the United Kingdom as well as around it. But you've got to remember that some parts of the country are quite difficult to access. Cornwall, which is the southwest tip of England, is a very long train ride, and the train might not take you exactly where you want to go. The nearest main stations are Exeter in Devon, and then there are small local lines which run out into Cornwall from there. Rail is very infrequent in the more rural places. For example, parts of northern England, the more remote parts of Wales and Scotland, are also quite intermittently served by rail and only have small branch lines. There are no main lines that run through these areas. Does anybody have any questions about any of that, or do they need something explained any better? Plenty of time for questions, so I'll take them now. Okay, so, what kind of vocabulary do I usually use? It depends in the travel. That is a good question. Well, we usually talk about, okay, for the railways, a branch line is a small local single track line. Main lines have up to 4 tracks and a much more frequent service. So when we talk about a branch line, these are the small local lines which serve more remote parts of the country. The main lines generally connect the big cities with a few stops in the way. For example, to get to where my mother lives, you would have to take a local train to Huntingdon. You could not travel from Edinburgh to Huntingdon directly. You would have to travel to Peterborough, which is the nearest big station, and take a more local train from Peterborough to Huntingdon, where she lives. For another example of local journeys, to get to the Isle of Wight, small island off the south coast, what you do is you take a mainline train from London Waterloo, and you then have to change to take the ferry across to the Isle of Wight. So the islands around the coast are served. Somebody's got a lot of noise on the sound. Are served by local ferry services. Now, large towns are served by coach services, so that larger towns as well as rail are also served by coach services. These journeys take longer than by train, but are much cheaper. So if you want to travel around the country and you are not in a hurry, then going by coach instead of train will take longer, but it will be much cheaper than using the trains usually. Now, London is easy to get around. Let me just explain the transport in London. I'll just put it into writing in short. In London, transport services are government run. I'll answer the question about different modes of transport and how long they take in a minute, but that is a very good question. London Transport provides government run transport in London. This includes the overground rail within London, the London Underground, which in many European countries is known as the Metro. It also includes bus and tram services, and even river services on the Thames. In the rest of the country, bus services are run by private operators. Bus services outside the cities are often expensive and unreliable. So if you're out in the countryside, buses are often less frequent, less reliable, they're less likely to run on time, and they usually are more expensive than bus services within cities. Referring to the transport times in the country, you will find that it depends very much on which parts of the country you want to travel to and from. For example, on the rail, London to Birmingham is about 90 minutes. and 8 hours from London to Edinburgh. Which is in Scotland.
Why bus service is unreliable in the UK?
Why bus services are, I'm
Is
sorry,
not is not reliable.
it depends very much on which part of the country you are in. If you're in London, the service is very frequent. At peak times, it can be every 5 minutes or less. Even on Sundays, Sunday is a day of rest in the United Kingdom, um, and public holidays, there is a bus service, but it is less frequent. You can still expect a bus every 15 minutes, no more than that, even at such times. And during the early hours of the morning, London does have a night bus service, less frequent than during the days, but you can expect a bus every 20 to 30 minutes, even in the early hours of the morning in London. Out in the countryside, you've got a lot of small villages with small numbers of people wanting to use buses, and that is one reason they are more expensive out in the countryside. They are also less likely to run on time. Um, in London, the buses are timed very accurately, and drivers get into trouble if they run too early or too late, unless there is good reason. But in countryside areas, you've got a lot of small country roads, often little more than lanes, which take longer to travel, and such roads can be more easily blocked if there is a road accident or adverse weather. So that is one reason why they are less reliable. In the Isle of Wight, a place I know well, some bus routes do not operate in winter because there are not enough people to justify running them. So generally you can travel by bus at night in the big cities and overnight coaches in between cities. But the real problem in the countryside is a low population density, difficult roads, and low numbers of people wanting to travel mean that the service is more expensive and less frequent. If you live in a very unlucky place, for example, my grandmother used to live in a place in Norfolk, there was no bus service at all. So you're reliant on your own car, somebody else giving you a ride, or a taxi in such places. However, I am talking about very sort of remote places like the middle of rural Norfolk there, where you've got a few farmers and very small scattered villages. In such places, local authorities do provide bus services to take children to and from school. In general, the smaller the place you want to get to or from, the more difficult it's going to be, the more time it will take, and it is also likely to cost you more than if you want to travel between two cities. Okay.
And I have another question. In the US, we have some services or some company like Uber and Lyft and these kind of things. Are they available in the UK?
Okay, I used to drive for Uber some years ago here in London. Uber operates in big cities. Um, they do operate in London. They operate in Birmingham, Manchester, in even some of the larger towns nowadays, particularly in the southeast. But of course, you are not likely to find an Uber server service running in the middle of rural Norfolk or Devon. There just aren't enough people there to justify providing the service. It is possible to get a taxi in such places, but it will be very expensive. But yes, we do have other hailing apps as well as Uber nowadays. There are quite a lot of them, but it is their choice as to which areas they serve. It means that those places which are not cost effective to serve are going to get much worse service. It is just how it always is, unfortunately. However, such places are not the kind of places where you are likely, to be getting a job. You are much more likely to be getting a job in the cities, and getting around will be much easier there. I'm not sure. Do you have ride-hailing services like Uber in Iran? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so we have as far as I know, we have some kind of services. It's like Snap in Iran, and I was told there are many other similar services like Uber and Lyft in Iran. So, but the most famous is something like Snap. So in Iran, we call it Snap. It's very similar to Uber or Lyft.
Yes, it is interesting that I think many countries have such hailing services now. Um, Before I forget, London, if you are working in London, there are black taxis. New York has its famous yellow taxis, London has its black taxis. These operate to and from the central London mostly. And the good thing about the black taxis is that you can just hail them by the road without booking. Most services, taxi services in this country, are what we call minicab services, and those you have to phone or use an app, and you have to arrange the ride in advance. However, it is worth pointing out that minicabs work out a lot cheaper than the black cabs do. For example, this is just an example of what you might expect. Um, the journey from Heathrow Airport to central London will typically cost between this varies a little bit by the time how busy it is, but it typically costs as much as 70 to 90 UK pounds. However, Uber may be as little as £20. So, unless you are very rich, if you want to travel by taxi from Heathrow into central London, then unless you've got money to burn, I would recommend you getting an Uber, and you will be able to get an Uber from Heathrow no problem at all. You can get a black cab just as easily, but it will be a lot more expensive than the minicab services. However, the black cabs have one advantage over the minicabs: they can use bus lanes and therefore tend to be quicker. They don't get caught in the traffic so much. And before you ask, the traffic in London is terrible. I'm just going to put this in writing as well. Black cabs are faster as they are allowed to use bus lanes. I'm not quite so sure about the other cities like Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, Sheffield, but in London I will say something about getting around by car. London has a low emission zone covering most of the city. As most of the city, and a congestion charge zone and the way it works is that if you drive into the congestion charge area during business hours, you will pay, I think it is £15 a day to enter, and parking charges, which I'll come to in a minute, are on top of that. Most of London is covered by the ultra-low emission zone, and you will pay extra if you drive an old polluting vehicle in these areas. The idea is to improve air quality and reduce pollution in London, which can sometimes be quite severe. So be aware that cars are not the best way of getting around in London. There is very limited car parking. In London, and what there is of car parking you have to pay for by hour. If you do not pay or stay longer than you have paid to stay, then you risk a parking ticket, which will be something like £80, which is what we call a fixed penalty notice. So if you park illegally in most of the cities, especially London, expect to get a parking ticket, and that is expensive. If you do not pay within 14 days, they double the amount you have to pay. So I do not recommend trying to get around London by car. There's little parking, the traffic is terrible, and there are a lot of extra charges. The low emission zone, the congestion charging zone in the centre of London, and you will also have to pay to park if you can find a space.
What do you mean by saying emission zone?
Okay, low emissions zone. I'll put this in writing in case anyone wants to look at this. This area covers most of the city of London, and including the place where I am living. The idea is to reduce pollution, and there is no extra charge for electric vehicles and some of the newer petrol vehicles which meet certain requirements. But for old vehicles which cause more pollution, you will end up paying a lot of extra money to drive in these areas. So if you drive an old polluting vehicle inside the ultra low emissions zone, you will find that you have to pay a lot more.
Gotcha. And what is the difference between black taxi and yellow taxi in the
Okay,
UK?
the yellow taxis, you are thinking of New York. I think they have to be licensed, and traditionally they are yellow. Our taxis in London, the most famous ones are the black taxis, which have to be licensed. And I'll put this down. Black taxi drivers have to pass an exam. This is known as the knowledge in the trade. To prove that they know their way around the whole of London, and to be able to pass that test, you really have to have lived in London all your life. London is a very old city. It is not on a logical grid pattern as, say, New York is, where it's nice, neat blocks. We have a lot of very old, narrow streets with buildings which are just as old, which were built long before cars were invented, and that is one reason why finding your way around London can be a challenge. You really do have to have knowledge of the layout of all the streets to pass the exam to become a black cab driver, and honestly, you need to have lived in London all your life to have that level of knowledge of all the streets. The minicab drivers, on the other hand, do not have to pass that exam, and many of them nowadays use technology to find the quickest possible route for a journey. For example, ride-hailing apps like Uber, the driver basically has the app running on his phone, and it will tell him what is likely to be the quickest route between two places. But of course you can change the route if you know that the traffic is bad on the route that it indicates. So, in a nutshell, the black cab drivers have much better knowledge of London. It is a large city, and it is a very old city, and the streets can be very confusing. They are not set out according to a centralised plan, as is the case in newer cities like New York. By the way, all taxi drivers have to be properly vetted, as we say. They have to have a criminal record check before they are given a license to operate, because after all, they will be carrying vulnerable people round late at night, for example. So you have to have a clean criminal record in order to get a license to drive a taxi. If you are found driving without a licence, the penalties can be severe. Does that answer the question? Okay, if nobody's got any further questions with regard to transport, and I'll give it a minute to be sure. I don't think there's anybody whose sound is not working, or I would have known about it by now. How much does it cost for personal automobile? Okay, that's a good question. Petrol is very expensive in this country. About 80% of what you pay is tax, but oil prices have also gone up recently. So petrol is currently around, I'll use that symbol to mean approximately, it's going to be about £1.70 per litre, and diesel even a little bit more. So that's something to think about, petrol and diesel prices here. are quite high. So that price is per litre. Sorry, £1.80, not £180. It's not quite as bad as that. As for tax, the last time I checked, you have to pay, I think it's £120 for tax. That's road tax. And an MOT, which is a test to make sure the vehicle is roadworthy. It will typically be somewhere like 50 to 60 £50 to £60 per year. You have to get your car MOT'd once a year, and that MOT stands for Ministry of Transport. That is basically a safety test to prove that your car is roadworthy, and you have to do that once a year. Apart from that, in short, okay, parking prices per hour, it depends quite a lot on where you are, but in London it can be, depending on exactly where you park and when, it's about £10 an hour for parking. So that's going to be on top of any other charges. For example, for congestion charge, £15 a day. I'm not sure what the ultra low emission zone charge is. It depends on the vehicle you drive. And if you're tempted to park illegally, parking tickets about £80 or £160 if you don't pay within 14 days. So don't be tempted to just park anywhere to disappear into a shop for 10 minutes. In London, there is a very good chance you will come out and find you have a parking ticket, and it is not cheap. Well, in London, and I know most about the fares in London, single bus journeys here, though, in London you are quite lucky. In London, single bus journeys are currently £1.65, and in less than an hour you can take more than one bus. So, for example, if I wanted to travel from here to Wembley Stadium, I would take one bus from outside here. I would change buses at Golders Green, and the second bus will take me from there to Wembley Stadium, provided that I board the second bus no more than 59 minutes after I got on the first. Then I will not pay extra for the second bus. So single bus journeys are £1.65 each, and underground varies by zone. Underground varies by zone and time of travel. Off-peak being cheapest. On the underground you can pay as little as £1.60, and it can go up to about £6 or £7 for one journey, through the centre of London at the most expensive times. The idea is to encourage people to travel at off-peak times if possible. If you want to see what the situation is in London, then the site to go for is, and if you look on there, you will find that there is a journey plan available as well. So this is basically the site that you want to go to, and this will tell you about transport within London, and it will give you information on fares as well as maps for the underground, bus routes and other modes of transport. There are also national sites. For National Rail, here is one I'd recommend. And this particular site is good because it will try to find you the best value train fares possible. So there are, as I said at the beginning, some different ways of saving money on transport in this country. But you have to be quite savvy about it and know what you are doing. But there are ways to save money on fares. Yes, it is true. Pricing policy is, the idea is to reduce the amount of congestion in London. Many of the journeys you see are single cars with a single occupant. They take up a huge amount of space. Cars are a very inefficient way of getting people around because you're looking at a lot of space, a lot of pollution to take around 1.5 tons of steel wherever you go. So it leads to congestion problems, pollution problems, and frankly there is not anywhere like enough space for everyone to park who might want to. The worst offenders for jamming the whole city up are parents taking their children a short distance to school by car when they could honestly take them another way. So the Mayor of London wants to encourage people to use the public transport wherever possible, or to cycle or walk if it is a short distance instead of driving. The idea being to free up the roads for those people who really have to drive, emergency vehicles, delivery drivers, doctors and midwives on call, that sort of thing. They want to keep the roads open for people who genuinely have to use them instead of people who just want to use them. That is the reason why. Air pollution in London can be quite bad occasionally when the weather conditions are adverse. I used to suffer from asthma quite severely in my younger days, but it has regressed a lot. But many people do have a very accurate air pollution monitor in the form of their asthma, and that isn't health issues are another reason for the low emission zones in London, and several of the other cities in this country have equivalent low emission zones as well. Having said that, usually the air is still a lot cleaner than in some cities in the world. A lot of the big cities in China and India in particular tend to have even worse pollution problems, and in places which are down in valleys with very light winds, the air pollution can really build up because there is no wind to disperse it. So all of these things determine how bad the pollution will be. Some older vehicles are more polluting. Some cities with less wind flow will tend to build up pollution more. Strong sunshine and high temperatures also make the problem worse. And of course, in some countries there are more laws to protect the air than there are in others. All of these things are factors. If you want to look at the history of how bad it used to be in London, have a quick read up on this one. Clean Air Act 1953. that was an act passed by Parliament following horrendous smogs which happened in the early 50s. A smog is basically fog which is contaminated with smoke. In the olden days, everybody used coal fires in their homes, and coal is the most dirty and polluting fuel there is, and sulphur impurities can also add to the breathing difficulties as well as causing acid rain. So many people died from respiratory conditions during the smogs that Parliament passed an emergency law, and that law is the Clean Air Act 1953. The air quality in London has got a lot better since that time. I think there are similar laws in some other big cities in the world. It's in the cities that air pollution tends to be worst. Okay, so unless anybody else has any further questions, I just want to talk about what the next session is going to be next Sunday. So does anybody have any further questions? I'll take them. If not, I've decided that we ought to talk in depth about getting visas to work in the UK or study, visit family, or for any other reason you may need a visa. So the next session is going to be on the topic of visas. Does anybody have any further questions? I have actually seen 2 or 3 references to visas today, and it was going to be in the programme. I do have a brief introductory video which I made since the last session that I did. This one is about obtaining a UK work visa, and because I think the subject is pertinent, I'll also put in a link to another one that I made about living costs in the UK. Not just about transport in particular, but all those bread and butter things such as tax, energy bills, and in particular housing costs. And if you have a quick look at these videos, I did have to make them in a fairly short space of time, so they are only an introduction. I have a very busy schedule nowadays, so but they do give you an idea at what you are looking at in the way of living costs, and you can of course pause them to look at the numbers. We will also be looking, though, next time, I'm going to make the topic UK visas, and I will outline the type of visas that you can get, what they are for, what their English requirements are, and how long they will let you stay. I will also guide you through the site, which you can actually use to find out which type of visa you need for certain.
David, how often people in the UK go abroad on traveling?
Okay, that depends. Some people, the wealthy people, might go on holiday more than once a year. I am a divorced man who has had all the problems that goes with it, and I have not had holidays for years. However, I have reasons to relocate out of the UK in the next few months. It will not affect my teaching, but part of the reason as a divorced man wanting to rebuild and move on, the costs are just so high here that given that the system, they want to take my money and give it to my ex-wife who only married me for money in the first place. Oh, and help to stay in the country. I do know the visa application system here well, as a quick hint. They want to give her all my money, so I've decided I've had enough and decided to start a new life elsewhere. As soon as I can save and afford to, I want to set up a solar-powered electronics business in, wait for it, Western Africa, but that is a few years away. I cannot save while I'm still living in the UK, and that was part of the reason, as well as requests from students, to know more about living costs. Basically, the title is what the government, employers, and notably people traffickers don't want you to know about living costs in the United Kingdom. If that has whet your appetite, we'll talk about visas, and actually a subsequent lesson might well be about UK living costs if it is requested by a lot of students. So we will definitely be covering visas in the next session, however, because that seems to be the most popular demand at the moment. I did say to Amid that I would ask, maybe have a show of hands, to decide on what each lesson's topic should be, and visas seem to be the popular demand for next session. I'll take any further questions. Okay, the justifying reasons, there can be some to get a visa. We'll look at this in detail next time, but the most obvious one is to work here. Generally speaking, for most jobs you will need to be at level B2 on the CEFR scheme, or you will need to be at level 5.5 to 6 on IELTS. We will look at these tests in depth if it is requested. However, some work areas have more stringent requirements, for example 7 on IELTS for the medical profession. You will generally need B2 to study here, get a student visa at degree level. If you are studying below degree level, then B1 intermediate is generally enough. For holidays, it is a lot simpler. The requirements are not very stringent at all. For the purpose of staying with family, or for joining your husband or wife in the United Kingdom, then you will only have to show a much lower requirement. I think it's A2 in listening and speaking skills only. I can't remember all of the requirements, but I do have the full information, which we can go through in a subsequent lesson, probably next one. There are a few more specialist visas. For example, ministers of religion have special visas. There are even visas for transit alone to travel through en route to somewhere else. Those are called transit visas. There will also be visas available for more specialist purposes, like, for example, to receive medical treatment. If, for example, you have an unusual operation which cannot be provided in Iran, but is available in the United Kingdom, then again there are specialist medical visas available which allow you to travel here for the purpose of the surgery or treatment. There are also a few ministerial visas, although probably there's no one here who needs to know too much about those. These are basically provided for diplomatic visits, that kind of thing. But those, again, are very specialist. Most people wanting a visa will be wanting to work here or study here, or sometimes they will be wanting to join family members who are in the United Kingdom already. There is, for those in a desperate situation, a scheme of asylum, and famously at the moment a lot of refugees from Ukraine are coming to other European countries. I sometimes, when I get the time, volunteer for the language assistance program, which provides language assistance for Ukrainian refugees. I did one of those sessions earlier today. So the main reasons, though, will be for either work or study, or it might be to join family who are already living in the United Kingdom. London, London is a very expensive place to live or to study. You would generally be staying in London either as a tourist for a limited time or more permanently to work or study. But do be advised that London has the highest living costs in the country. Around this area, to rent one room will cost you something like 500 UK pounds a month, which is well over 600 US dollars a month equivalent.
What is the cost of living in the UK or London in general?
London
For
has by far the highest
family?
living costs. Private rents for, as I say, a room are £500 a month. Note, I said room, I did not say flat or house. Privately rented houses in London, in central London, can be up to £2,000 a month. Living costs in the other UK cities are not cheap, but they are far lower than London. And if you have a quick peep at one of the videos, I sent the links just now, they will give you a basic outline of how the different places compare. I must say that these are only a general indication. Individual locations can vary hugely, and in fact there can be huge variations in rents between different places in a single city. Okay, are there any further questions?
Sorry, do you have my voice?
Yes, is it you who just put your hands up? I just noticed that.
Yeah.
It is, yeah.
Uh, yeah. What tips or advices do you offer for convincing embassy officer for visa?
Okay, what I would say is
What should we talk about, or our body language, our appearance, or anything?
right. First of all, you've got to look and act the part, but it will depend on what you want to come to the UK for. Obviously, if it is for work purposes, you need to talk about your job. You will need proof of sponsorship from an employer in most cases. Um, when you are interviewed for the job, it will usually be done online. Ask if the employer is able to provide such a sponsorship, and if they can, you need to show that to the officer in question. These days you can apply for visas online as well, but you will need to send the documentation. If it is for a student visa, then you need to have an offer to study for a degree, for example, from the university you study at. The university will provide this so that you can show that you have good reason to have a student visa. There are people who are going to try to lie and cheat the system, and of course, the officers are trained to spot this. I will let you in on a secret here or two. I used to work in private security years ago here in the United Kingdom until an accident with that shoulder put me out of security work. I've got steel plates in there since I had an operation as a result. But I know the kind of tricks and the kind of body language that people do um, use, that either to try to lie. It is generally best not to try to lie, and the reason is simple. It is very difficult to lie consistently, as the police will know when they interview you. You have to lie convincingly, and it takes only one inconsistency, and you get found out. So you've got, if you're want to come here for as a refugee, you've got to show where you came from, the reasons you left there, very often those reasons will be well known. You might be facing persecution, warfare. Of course, we've got the special visa fast track scheme for Ukrainian citizens at the moment, as have most European countries. In these cases, then it will be relatively easy. If you have already arrived illegally, you've got a much harder mountain to climb. They will probably detain you for several months in that case while they investigate your case, so that they can make an informed decision on whether your case is genuine or not. You might have heard that we do have a problem whereby people are conned into paying all their life savings to criminal gangs who then set them out to cross the English Channel in a small boat I wouldn't honestly use for a trip to the seaside. So it all depends on your reason for coming, but certainly I can provide help when it comes to body language, things like that, because I have had prior training myself. That would be the subject for a one-to-one video session. If you're interested in that, it could be arranged. I hope I haven't frightened everybody off by saying that, by the way. I'm just here to teach you. That's all I'm here to do. I don't work in security anymore, and don't worry, I'm not employed by the border agency either. It is a very long story of how I managed to assist my ex-wife to stay here. Very long story. But at the time, unfortunately, I didn't realise that we had, I will put it this way, ulterior motives. Does anybody have any further questions? I don't want to miss anyone out. I don't see any hands up or any new questions. I see one hand. Okay, let's go over to you. Okay, somebody had their hands up there. I wish I knew how to pronounce the names so I know who I'm speaking to, but there's a couple of people showing they're in the green but no more hands up, so who wants to go first? Okay, I don't see any more hands, so unless anybody has any further questions, normally these sessions are for an hour. It's been a little longer, but I don't mind at the moment because I don't have anything booked for a few minutes yet, so I'm not going to be looking at a timer or anything like that. So if anybody does have any further questions, we will be talking in depth about visas next Sunday, however.
Sorry, do you have any experience about immigration and uh, the challenges you should face? For example, feelings. Um, some
Right. Okay. Again, it depends on the circumstances in which you arrived in the United Kingdom. Um, the emphasis of the rules here is basically to encourage people to come legally through approved channels, if at all possible. Obviously, if you have just left a place where war has broken out, we had a lot of refugees from Syria, for example. Many European countries did. Many of those, obviously, you can't expect them to have sat there online applying for visas, realistically. Um, in such cases, they are dealt with on the basis of the merits of their case. International law, strictly speaking, says that as a refugee, you should accept asylum in the nearest safe country that you get to. So, to be honest, the United Kingdom is not likely to be, truthfully, the nearest safe country from most places. For example, the nearest um, feeling homesick. That's an interesting one, which I'll come to in just a second. Um, but in theory, the nearest safe places to Syria would be Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and I'm just going by my knowledge of geography. There are often just reasons why such people might want to come to a different country, including the UK. They may already have family here, or they may also have the language skills in, say, English, but they don't have the language skills in Greek or Turkish. So I can understand why sometimes people might not want to seek asylum in the first safe country they reach. But such cases are always considered on their merits, and I don't agree with this, but the government here have just introduced a policy of sending people who have arrived illegally. For example, they've crossed the channel illegally in a dangerous boat. What they are planning to do is basically send them to the African country of Rwanda, where their cases for asylum will be considered. The idea there is to try to do something to help them without, while putting the traffickers out of business. But remember that they're conning people out of their life savings and then endangering their lives ultimately, without trying to operate a closed door policy. Australia is notoriously hard to get into, but the whole subject of immigration, and in particular illegal immigration, is a very contentious topic here. It's very controversial. If you ask the 10 different British people for their views on it, you'll probably get 10 different answers. Feeling homesick. Now, I'm just thinking you might feel homesick after. You might miss your home country even if something has happened. A lot of Ukrainians will feel homesick quite naturally. They wouldn't have left Ukraine without a good reason, of course. So I do help quite a number of students, either in person or in the group sessions with language skills. I don't have the finances to do anything to help them in that way, so I offer language skills instead. I think many British people are charitable enough to do what they can to help, but the logistical problems in a small, densely populated country like this mean that, unfortunately, we can't just have an open door policy. We already, for example, have a housing crisis in the United Kingdom, something which is mentioned in the video which I've shown you above. It's one of those two links which I just posted earlier on.
And how do you evaluate racism in UK and the attitude of people here to
Racism, okay, I'll be honest and truthful here. We do have it. It's an underlying problem which surfaces occasionally. Very occasionally it can be quite bad. There have been incidents. For example, try to a Google search for David, not a relative of mine, who set off nail bombs in Brick Lane in the east of London. If you look at that, we do have a very small number of mostly small far-right groups like the National Front. They were around in the 70s and 80s. Since then we've had the British National Party, and another one you might want to Google is this one. the English Defence League, who claim to be a Christian organisation, but I don't think they fool most people. Having said that, the groups are very small and splintered. They are not coordinated. No far-right party has ever won a parliamentary seat in the UK Parliament, unlike in some European countries. In France, we have Le Pen. We've got, what's his name, Gerrit Velder or something like that in the Netherlands. Of course, you've got the Austrian Freedom Party as well. But far-right parties have never been very popular in this country for a number of reasons, not least the fact that we fought the Second World War against them. Racism exists at low level in small pockets, but I would say that it is usually less prevalent than it is in many other countries, certainly less so than Eastern Europe, where there's often been a problem, and even America. In America, you famously had the Ku Klux Klan, and there are still white supremacist groups there as well. Incidentally, you might find this quite amusing in a way. I had one old not work colleague as such, but somebody where I worked once, make a remark that I must be racist, and I turned around and I said, "Oh, racist, am I? Then can you explain to me how comes my daughters look like this?" I pulled out my phone and showed a picture. I have two mixed race daughters. Racism can be a problem from time to time, but it is not as big a problem as it is in many other European countries, or certainly America. But I think that is a good, fair question to ask. Okay, I can take one or two more because I would like to at least get some coffee before. No, I've got a few minutes yet before another lesson. Sometimes I have to go straight to a lesson after this, so if this happens, I'm not being rude or anything like that. It's just that Preply caused me a lot of problems if I miss the start of a lesson and get reported absent. So, does anyone have any further questions at all? I've got one more. It looks as though we've opened a can of worms here. That is an English phrase because all of a sudden everyone wants to ask questions. Okay, let's make the most of a few 3 minutes. Do you want to go ahead? I think often in these lessons people put their hands up and then don't want to speak because they either think they're going to interrupt somebody else. Okay, let's try again. Do you want to bring it in?
Uh, Hey, can you hear me?
I can hear you, no problem.
Um, hey everybody, I'm very glad to catch up with you guys. I'm not quite sure whether somebody asked you this question before, but would you please explain a little bit about the job opportunities in the UK and what's the current situation as well as the projection for the future? Thank you.
Okay, it very much depends on what kind of job you were talking about. Um, I would say the best jobs to be in are the jobs in healthcare, teaching, local authorities. Um, those are some of the favourite choices. If you prefer something which is more hands-on, then we always need construction workers. Seasonal farm labourers are in hugely short supply. Another skill that we are very short of in this country is lorry driving. Note that to train to be a lorry driver here, you will need about 5,000 UK pounds, unless you are lucky and find an employer who sponsors you. Um, But generally speaking, for most, I would recommend that the best jobs to go for, the most secure, would be teaching, public administration, healthcare, local government, and then there are jobs in construction, and perhaps these are more seasonal, agriculture as well. These are the skills which are in demand. We do also have something which is called the shortage occupation list. I don't have this list to hand, and it does change from time to time, but that basically is a list of professions where we are short of skilled and qualified personnel, and employers are able to offer the positions on this list to people from other countries. It used to be UK or European Union would automatically get preferential treatment for jobs, and then others would be invited if they could not fill the positions. But nowadays, it's since we left the European Union, which incidentally I voted against, it tends to be UK and rest of world. So if your profession is on that shortage occupation list, I can look up, I think I ought to put it in my diary to look that up in time for the next session about visas. It seems quite relevant. The shortage occupation list, if your occupation is on that list, then you will find it much easier to get a job and hence a work visa for the UK, because those positions have a skills shortage. In particular, there is a great deal of shortage in healthcare, particularly for doctors and nurses. Okay, well, it looks as though the session time's out. The warning I've got just came on less than a minute, and it's either in Persian or Farsi, but I can see the countdown timer, and it's got about 40 seconds left to run. So I think we've had quite a good innings, as we English say today. So we will be on the topic of visas next time around, and I will also get an up-to-date copy of the shortage occupation list for that time. Okay, since I'm going to be cut off, I'll say goodbye to you now, and I'll see you next week. Goodbye for now.